Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight as we have another lecture series in collaboration with the University of Belize, the Institute for Social and Cultural Research, and the Belize National Historical Society. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. We have a few participants here via Zoom, and we also want to say thank you to everyone that is watching us live on Facebook right now. Please share, comment. The way that we are going to start this particular lecture is that we're going to start off with the national anthem. I will introduce our presenter, Dr. David Gomez. And then, of course, he will give his presentation, followed by a Q&A and concluding remarks. I know that it is very late. It is very late, and I know it's very early for wherever in the world Dr. David Gomez is. He will tell us in a few. And so without further ado, let's get started with the national anthem. If you would all kindly mute your mics as we get started, and I will have my co-host play that national anthem in the background. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all so much for your patience. And now, without further ado, I would like to present our lecturer for this evening, Dr. David Gomez. And this first lecture tonight is part of a three-part lecture series titled Revisioning Belize History. And this will be done by Dr. David Gomez. So this is just part one of three different presentations to come. And David is a 9th or 10th generation Belizean of Creole descent. And one of his early ancestors, 𝗿𝗲𝗃𝗏, was one of the original Baymen and a member of the old oligarchy in the settlement of British Honduras, where he was involved in logwood and mahogany cutting, as well as providing riverboat services. He also chides that another great grand relative of his was Ben Stewart, and he was involved in the mahogany trade and was one of the early rich men in the settlement of Belize. David holds a PhD in Latin American and Caribbean history from the Institute of the Americas at the University College London, where his thesis titled Canals and Borders, The Dynamics of British Expansion in Central America and the Anglo-Guatemalan Territorial Dispute over Belize circa 1821 to 1863, which showed the Great Britain subordinated the settlement of Guatemala's territorial claim to Belize to maintaining British predominance in Central, because doing so enabled Britain to forestall French and US expansion in Central America. Was praised for his original approach and contribution to the study of the dispute, by extension, Belizean history. Dr. Gomez also holds a Master of Laws in International Trade Law and a Master of Arts in International Relations with distinction, completed as a Schevening Scholar in the United Kingdom, along with a graduate diploma in International Development from the London School of Economics through the University of London, and a Bachelor of Science in Secondary Education from the University of Belize. They will be the first to tell you that UB was the most difficult study he completed, as that is the only degree he didn't achieve a distinction in. I think we have some professors here that will probably tell you otherwise. Dr. Gomez also has over a dozen continuing and executive education qualifications, including in diplomacy, sustainability, leadership, copyright policy and law, trade policy, and innovation policy for small states, among others. Dr. Gomez is a former diplomat for Belize and helped set up the now closed permanent mission of Belize to the United National and World Trade Organizations in Geneva, where he was posted between 2000 and 2003. And he also worked in a regional diplomatic capacity in the Caribbean as a manager of trade and export development at the Caribbean Export from 2011 to 2014. Dr. Gomez is currently an associate professor of sustainable business strategies in London, where he also lectures on foreign trade and investment, and recently served as an adjunct associate professor of business strategy at Galen University, where he also lectured for a course on comparative politics. He was also previously an adjunct lecturer at the University of Belize, where he taught courses on socioeconomic development, international business, and an introductory course on international relations from 1999 to 2000, and again from 2003 to 2005. Dr. Gomez also serves as the director of the Ramphal Institute, a policy research Commonwealth organization registered in England and Wales, a position he has held for the past 5 years, and is a managing partner in Launchpad Consulting, a small but well-respected international development management consulting service firm. He co-founded in Belize in 2000 June. Through his firm, Dr. Gomez has also worked for several regional and international organizations on several medium and long-term development projects in Belize and Barbados, from where he served the wider Caribbean, Africa, Botswana, and Ghana, and Papua New Guinea in the South Pacific. Dr. Gomez is currently guest editing a special edition of the Roundtable Journal of Commonwealth Affairs on Climate Justice, and on the Commonwealth scheduled for publication in August of this year, and previously edited in 2022. Another special edition of the Journal on Climate Change and the Commonwealth. He is working on turning his PhD thesis into a book, and is conducting research for 2 other books, one provisionally titled A History of Belize in 7 Disasters, and another on the relationship between the annual Holy Saturday cross-country cycling race and development of national identity in Belize, circa 1929 to 2010. Dr. Gomez has also published several papers, including a chapter in a book on small states, published by the University of Malta and the Commonwealth Secretariat, and policy papers on the history of fiscal policy and bus transportation in Belize as part of the now defunct Catalyst Institution of Public Policy and Research. Ladies and gentlemen, I give the floor to Dr. David Gomez.
April, thank you very much for that. Good evening, and thanks to all of you who have joined us this evening for this, the first of our three-part lecture series aptly titled, I think, Revisioning Belizean History. Let me start by just thanking Mr. 𝗥𝗲𝗃𝗏 and the Belize National Historical Society, or the BNHS, for helping to bring this event together. Mr. Rolando Quacom and Delmer Zib from the University of Belize, an Institute of Cultural and Social Research, for partnering with us as well for these lectures. Let me use this opportunity to congratulate the BNHS for the anniversary of its founding. Albert, I'm not sure how many years, 5, 6, but congratulations. Albert tells me that the society has some 25,000 members. That is a remarkable achievement, so congratulations. This evening's lecture, labeled The Origins of the Settlement, a Reconsideration, examines, as the title suggests, the origins of the Belize, or of the English settlement of British Honduras, which eventually gained colony status in 1862 and later had its name changed to Belize in 1973 before independence in 1981. Slide 2, please, April. I think it is fair to say that many of us have accepted somewhat uncritically and repeated without hesitation the history-long claim that Belize was first settled by a shipwrecked Scottish privateer or buccaneer named Wallis and his crew in 1638, and that the name Belize is derived from a corruption of the name Wallis. Acceptance of these accounts of the history of Belize have not been limited, I believe, to ordinary Belizeans, and in fact has been repeated by many respected historians and other academics and scholars writing about Belize, both those sympathetic to the Anglo and British narratives, as well as those sympathetic to Guatemalan and Spanish narratives. I should state that these accounts and claims have never rested well with me, and today the question of when did the British begin to settle in Belize, or the English begin to settle in Belize, remains inconclusive. Though, as Professor Mavis Campbell did offer, that answering this question is stubborn, and we will probably never be able to answer it precisely, but I think we can at least triangulate properly. Next slide, please. Notwithstanding, I think the challenges to establishing the origins of the Belize settlement emanating from the lack of documentation, there is of late movement on this matter, and after almost 2 centuries of enduring these persisting but unsubstantiated accounts of Belizean history, scholars have started to tackle this question more seriously. In 2016, Barbara Bulmer-Thomas and Professor Victor Bulmer-Thomas published an article titled The Origins of the Belize Settlement, wherein they discredited the national myths about Wallis, arguing that Wallis never existed and that therefore he never could have founded the settlement. As such, they argued that the name of the country cannot be derived from the name Wallis. I agree. I completely agree. Notably, the authors also disputed the 1638 date as the time when the settlement at Belize was founded, and argued that the conditions for this to happen were not present until 1642. That is, that the Spanish naval fortress at Salamanca de Bacalar, or Bacalar as we know it, which prevented the British from establishing a permanent foothold in Belize, was sacked by Diego or El Mulato, a friend of the British, in that year. But that did not qualify, but they did qualify, I think, that did not mean that the settlement did not happen, right? Or did happen or did get established then. These revisions to Belizean history, or to Belizean historiography, especially the change in date about the origins of the settlement, are ones which Belize's foremost historian of the territorial dispute with Guatemala, Assad Schumann, seems to agree with, as evidenced by his statement in the book Guatemala's Claim to Belize, The Definitive History, published in 2018, that exactly when the British began to settle in Belize, first known as the settlement in the Bay of Honduras, is uncertain. However, Schumann differs in that he places the date of the settlement at Belize about a decade later, in or around 1652, and Schumann contends, rightly so in my opinion, that the British did not settle in significant numbers until the 1670s. Other historians have also intimated through their research and publications different dates for the founding of the settlement, most of these later than 1638. For example, A.P. Thornton, in the paper titled The English at 𝗏𝗄𝑝𝘀𝑒, stated that the English from Jamaica had been cutting logwood since 1662. Gilbert Joseph also believes that the settlement was established in and around 1660. But Jesse Cromwell, likewise, in his paper, Life on the Margins, Ex-Buccaneers and the Spanish Subjects on the 𝗏𝗄𝑝𝘀𝑒 logwood periphery, places the activity of British logwood cutters in the area at a much later date, so around the 1670s, which is consistent with Schuman's contention that the British did not settle in significant numbers until this period. Professor Michael Camille goes further, and in the paper Historical Geography of the Belizean Logwood Trade suggests that 1680 was the appropriate date for the first settlement of the Englishmen in Belize. A scan of the literature suggests that there are at least 15 suggested dates for the origins of the settlement at Belize, ranging from as early as 1603 by Francisco Asturias and Jose Antonio Calderón Quijano to as late as 1717, Crescencio Carrillo y Ancona in 1871 and Ángel Núñez Ortega in 1877. To be sure, that is a discrepancy of over 100 years, 114 years to be exact, with dates suggested in no less than 8 different decades and 2 different centuries. It's rather confusing. The sheer number of dates are as confounding as the literature is unconvincing, and at times to me it appears to resemble a version of the popular game of chicken dropping regularly played in San Pedro and 𝗏𝗏𝘃𝗶𝘀𝗏, where a chicken or rooster gets to walk across a board filled with numbers and people place bets on their preferred number. If the chicken or rooster poops on your selected number, you're a winner. I think it feels like that a bit when we're talking about the date of origins of Belize. That's being a bit facetious. But the problem with many of the existing accounts about the origins of the settlement at Belize in British Honduras is that not only are they not adequately supported by historical evidence, but they also do not provide feasible explanation or plausible explanations of the dates they have put forward for this event. Schumann and the Bulmer-Thomases have changed this propensity and offer plausible explanations for their suggested dates. That is, that the conditions were in place for the settlement to have been founded. For Schumann, this involved the final abandonment of the Spanish fort at 𝗏𝗏𝗃, which continued to operate at a degraded capacity after it was sacked by El Mulatto a decade earlier. In my own research for my PhD, I struggled to find any evidence anywhere. That is, in the archival sources I consulted in Guatemala, the Library of Latin American Studies at Tulane University in New Orleans, the Library of Congress and the archives in Washington, D.C., and even the British Library and National Archives in London, which supports the claim that the Belize settlement was founded in 1638. I think to get around the challenge of the lack of documentation, I changed the frame of analysis to that of an economic history perspective, or at least a perspective that is not intent on demonstrating a more compelling legal argument as to the sovereignty over the territory. By using a different frame of analysis, I had the benefit of removing the bias for a political argument for supporting the position that Britain, which I should mention did not exist as England and Scotland only formed a union in 1707, or for British subjects settled in the territory around 1638, and allowed for different historical events to be interpreted differently, and for issues or events which would otherwise have been glossed over to be considered more deeply. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns prevented my consulting archival sources in Spain, which I had planned, but I still have not made it to the latter archive and sources after completing my PhD. Returning to the theme of the lecture today, I think the arguments posited by the Bulmer-Thomases about the origins of the settlement at Belize have profound implications for our understanding of Belizean history, and I want to revisit this issue this evening for a few reasons. Firstly, and this is the main reason, from my research, I have gained insights and uncovered information that support shifting the date of when the settlement was established, but later than the 1642 date suggested by Bulmer-Thomases, and later still than the 1652 date posited by Assad Schumann. In fairness to both sets of authors, I must admit that they did not expressly state that the settlement was founded on either of these dates, only as I previously stated that in both cases the conditions were right for that to happen. Secondly, I think it struck me as rather odd that many of the history books on Belize I've read or consulted at some point put forward dates and events without adequate supporting evidence. This was one reason I was interested in completing a PhD, because many of the historical events about Belize seem to be thinly supported. For instance, I was not satisfied with the lack of explanation as to why the British never converted Belize into a formal colony for decades and then did so suddenly in 1862. In this case, I believe I now provide an original response to this occurrence in my PhD thesis, and perhaps I should consider making that the theme of one of the lectures in this series. I think there's space for us to do that, so let's see. Finally, I believe that my research confirms that despite the shift in date of the origins of the settlement at Belize, logwood was indeed the raison d'etre for the settlement. Or to quote Professor Alan Craig, logwood was a factor in the settlement of British Honduras. And be that the piracy, privateering, and buccaneering factor needs to be given deeper consideration. Because in my view, not only in the settlement origins is this important, but also in the relationship between this and the settlement's strategic value to Great Britain, especially as it relates to Guatemala's territorial claim to Belize. Again, I have provided an original response to the latter in my PhD thesis and believe that the former warrants further discussion. I will attempt to do so tonight, or at least to start that discussion, and see if we can move the scholarship beyond the orthodox position, which holds only that shipwrecked privateers or buccaneers were the first ones to settle in Belize, and move that towards understanding how and why exactly this happened and could have played a role in the settlement's founding. So if Wallace did not exist, and there was no shipwrecked group of privateers or buccaneers that landed on Belize's shores and decided to give up privateering or buccaneering and take up logwood cutting, what then are the origins of the Belize settlement? This question is one which, in terms of establishing a specific date, has been the difficult one to answer conclusively. And several other contemporary historians and scholars of Belizean history have recognized this and pointed to the lack of documentation as the key challenge. However, both Schumann and the Bulmer Thomases have, by focusing on the historical conditions at the time, have offered a different means of triangulating this. I will try to build on these new approaches by looking more deeply at additional factors, and in doing so, believe it is useful to unpack and re-examine a few things about the historical claims around the origins of the English settlement at Belize in the 17th century. Specifically, I think it's important that this event involved English buccaneers or privateers and not British ones for the reasons already mentioned, and that these buccaneers supposedly gave up their privateering ways and took up logwood cutting in the bay. I will treat these 2 points, though not necessarily in that order, and will also look briefly at the possible role played by the contraband trade through Belize from Jamaica. However, before I continue, I must offer a disclaimer, admit that I will perhaps disappoint some of you when I say that in tonight's lecture, I will not be examining the Anglo-Guatemalan territorial dispute or the matter of the border or any of those issues, or even speculate on the possible outcomes of the case before the ICJ. Indeed, when I think the notice for the lectures went up, one of the persons did say commently, someone did say publicly on social media that they hope that the lectures will address the matter of the Guatemalan claim. I don't think that that is the space for this at the moment. I can do that at another time, and I think I have an original PhD thesis that can address a lot of the concerns or issues around that. So if anyone attending this online lecture is expecting to hear about these themes or settlement of the dispute, I'm sorry, but I hope that you would nonetheless stay tuned, as I believe that what I will be sharing can provide a new understanding about the origins of our beloved little Belize, or the jewel as we affectionately refer to it. Next slide, please. As we may all know, I think logwood or 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗏𝗃𝗏𝗃, I could never pronounce that word, logwood I always say, is one of several types of dyewoods found in the Americas. And this was important for several decades following Columbus's visits to the New World, not only as an export earner for the colonies, but also for the textile industries in England, as well as those in other parts of Europe, including France, the Netherlands, Italy, and Spain. Notably, I think the discovery of logwood in the New World coincided with early growth and development of the textile industry in England. Some scholars have gone as far as claiming that after sugar, logwood was the second most important export from the West Indian colonies. Certainly in the case of Belize, logwood was significantly more important than sugar for decades before sugar became an important export commodity for the country. Logwood and other types of dyewoods grew abundantly in the Americas and could be found mainly on coastal areas across the Indies, including in the Antilles, Jamaica, Brazil, Nicaragua, the Bay of Honduras, the Yucatan Peninsula, and the Bay, especially in the Bay of Campeche. I think the latter two areas in Yucatan and the Bay of Campeche, especially in the Laguna de Terminos and the Bay of Honduras, were the important centers of logwood extraction historically. Many of these dyewoods are known by different names, including Brazil wood, palo de Campeche, palo de tinto, and Nicaragua wood, among others. The availability of logwood and the commodity's value as a dye for textiles became known to the Europeans not long after Columbus's expeditions to the New World. And Columbus may have taken back samples of logwood and other dyewoods to Spain on returning from his many voyages. Samples may also have been taken back by other explorers shortly thereafter or in the early years of the 16th century. However, dyewoods or other species and types were long known to the Europeans, especially the dyers and merchants. And there are historical records showing that the cities in northern France, as well as Italy and the Low Countries, for example, Belgium and the Netherlands, I believe, were importing quantities of logwood as early as the late 13th and 14th century. So in other words, from the late 1200s to some 200 years before Columbus sailed to the New World, dyewoods were being imported into Europe. When therefore logwood was found in the Americas and in widespread use by the native populations, Spanish explorers immediately recognized its potential commercial value in Europe to Europe for the cotton, silk, and woolen industries there, but also for dyeing other stuff like leather, and even for writing. The Maya used it for writing on stele and the stone steles and stuff, right? One scholar noted in what is now a dated but still one of the only comprehensive studies about logwood around that the Lacandon Indians of Chiapas and Itzá of Petén used dyes extracted from logwood for their textiles, and they also used the wood from the tree for the tips of their arrows. In fact, I think when Hernando Cortés entered the Nahuatl Aztecs in 1519, when he encountered them, he reported that they were dressed as in the rich violet and black colors derived from logwood extract. In other parts of Mexico, I think the Aztecs also used dyes extracted from dyewoods, but also used cochineal, which is from a little insect, though they likely traded for this. But Amerindian societies also use dyes from dyewoods for different purposes. The Mayas, as I said, used the wood from the logwood tree, among a variety of other reasons for construction. I think they used it to build the vaults and the beams, and the leaves for medicinal purposes. Apparently, if you have really bad diarrhea, you can boil the logwood leaves, and that would help, right? So that's a medicine for some of you if you're suffering at the moment. In the 16th century, the importance of the trade in logwood to the Spanish crown was such that the crown declared logwood a monopoly and tried to set up a monopoly trade for Brazil wood as well. And it also tried to prevent the depression of prices. So King Ferdinand of Spain limited the royal monopoly to exports of 50 tons per year from Spain. So I think protecting the trade in logwood and the expected profits from this prompted the Spanish crown to form the Casa de Contratación, and this merchant house would manage the commerce of Spain's colonial empire for nearly 300 years and was an important part of the United Provinces of Central America at the time that Belize became an important entrepot for trade into that area that helped to prise open the Spanish monopoly of trade and to end Spain's colonial rule over the region. So part of the Contratacion's responsibility was to encourage the import of dyewoods from Spanish America and to forbid the importation from elsewhere. Of course, that had implications for logwood from the Indies because that had to then be exported, but only by duly authorized merchants from New Spain, especially logwood that was cut by the English, or that were seized by English and Dutch privateers and pirates. Then, given the value of the dyes to the textile industry in Europe, the Spanish crown encouraged the trade in logwood, but for several decades, only 500 tons or so of the commodity was exported annually on average from the Indies and Spanish America. And between 1503 and 1522, only 30 tons on average were exported annually to Spain. It was not until much later that the trade in logwood reached its potential. And as a result of that, the promised riches of for the Spanish crown from logwood never really materialized, at least not in the 16th century. And by the time the market for this opened fully in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the British and Dutch controlled large shares of the trade. So several factors may have contributed to the relative low levels of the early trade of logwood. I think for one, the pre-existing trades of other types of dyes and dyewoods, including from the Mediterranean, had continued. And in fact, by the mid to late 1300s, northern Italians were trading for Brazil wood, or what was called Brazil wood in the scholarship. And they were also trading with Persians as well as the Cumanian merchants from the North Sea, so or what is today the area that includes Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and parts of Russia. So if any of you know your geography well, you can kind of picture where that is. It's just across from where Ukraine is located at the moment. So Belgium and the Netherlands were also importing significant quantities of dyewoods from other sources in the late 13th and 14th centuries. In that trade, I think Turkey was an important exporter of dyes and also for textiles. And Spain was the important exporter of dyes and dye stuff to England. And those were indispensable to the nascent and then nascent English textile industry. I think these older trade networks and relations are obviously well developed by the time logwood from Yucatan and the Bay of Honduras was discovered and started to be exported as possible alternatives for dyes for the textile industries in Europe. And hence, I think it was because of that, it is likely that the merchants in control of these older trades strongly resisted changing to these new sources because it meant involving new merchant networks for trading for logwood. And we know how people are when you control a trade. You don't want anybody else to be a part of that, right? Next slide, please. Secondly, I think during the 16th century, healthy trade in Brazil wood, which yields shades of orange through dark pink colors, developed out of northern and western Brazil. So maybe my shirt was dyed with Brazil wood. I'm not sure. And that involved primarily the Portuguese and French, and later also the Dutch. But it is reported that from, I think, as early as the 1530s, the French had set up a triangular trade with West Africa involving a range of products, including Brazil wood. Not surprisingly, Brazil provided most of the Brazil wood needed for the dyes by the then expanding textile industries of Europe. And from as early as 1499, the northern coast of South America, including Venezuela, was yielding merchantable quantities of the commodity. So this trade preempted the trade in logwood, which was valued for its varying shades of purple and black. And the merchant networks for Brazil tended to develop and mature much faster, I think, than that of logwood. By 1580, the Dutch had also become firmly involved in that trade, which was not surprising given the value of dyewoods trade at the time. And by the 1590s, the Dutch had developed a vigorous contraband trade in dyewoods along the Caribbean coastline of South America. So not so much the Caribbean here, but starting from about Panama, Colombia, and down, the Dutch controlled a lot of the trade there. But they didn't really engage in logwood cutting in themselves. That is really hard work. So the Dutch later set up and used what was called the West India Company to help prise open Spain's monopoly of trade with the New World. And they were heavily involved in privateering and piracy on the seas. Between 1628 and 1636, thereabouts, Dutch pirates seized more than 547 Spanish vessels. And in 1628, they managed to seize an entire flota, so the entire flotilla coming down from Spain, making its way to the New World. The Dutch pirates were able to seize that. I'll speak a bit more about the connection between buccaneering and the establishment of settlement of Belize later on. But for now, I think it's notable that during the 16th and 17th centuries, the production of indigo native to Guatemala, which gives you a bright blue dye, may have affected the Spanish trade in logwood as well. By 1570, indigo production in the New World had surpassed or supplanted all dyewood trade from Spanish America, though the indigo trade did not reach its golden period until about 1760 when the logwood trade started to decline. So still, indigo alongside silver and cattle was especially important to the Guatemalan merchants, and demand for indigo grew greatly in Europe, especially during the period of the Consulado de Comercio de Guatemala, because the Consulado focused primarily on developing this trade, so much so that between 1791 and 1800, the average annual trade of indigo was around 876,000 pounds per year, and reached a high of 1.15 million pounds in 1793. So a significant amount of trade. A vigorous trade in cochineal from Spanish America also existed and was important to the merchants there. Cochineal was reportedly the most valuable export from colonial New Spain after silver, and at one point displaced several insect dyes and other dyes that were being used in Europe, or the old world as they used to call it. By 1825, cochineal exports from the United Provinces of Central America was as high as $2.5 million, followed by indigo at $2 million. So there's a very healthy trade was happening out of the region. Most of the cochineal trade, as with indigo, took place through Puerto Caballos on the Caribbean coast of Honduras. Together, cochineal and indigo were very profitable and they were produced widely in Central America and continued to be the main export earners for the region, which underscored the significance of natural dyes to the economy of parts of Spanish America, unlike the islands in the West Indies, where sugar was the main export commodity. Next slide, please. During the 16th century and in the first half of the 17th century, the involvement of British woodcutters in the logwood industry in Yucatan was relatively non-existent. But some English woodcutters may have been involved in the cutting and trading of Brazil wood from other parts of the Indies and maybe even from northern South America. One possible reason for this had to do with prohibitions in England against logwood. Starting in the second half of the 16th century, around 1558-60, the English crown passed certain prohibitions against importation and use of logwood due to, as the archives has it, colors being false and deceitful to the Queen's subjects and discreditable beyond the sea to English merchants and dryers. The first prohibition against logwood came in 1581 when its use in dyeing and its presence was banned. And one scholar argued that this ban left the English textile sector at a significant disadvantage vis-a-vis textile sectors in other European countries who are already more advanced. To be sure, I think in the late 16th century and well into the first half of the 17th century, English cloths were shipped mostly undyed and unfinished. The English crown subsequently made additional proclamations against logwood, including in 1583, 1597, 1607, 1630, and again in 1636, which was only a couple of years before the settlement at British Honduras was purportedly established. And in England, there was a very powerful and effective lobby against logwood. And this was illustrated in a case where, following a letter from the Lord Mayor of London to the Earl of Worcester concerning a complaint about the fraudulent way in which black silk had lately been dyed in the city, an inquiry was instituted, and all persons that were not registered dyers were ordered to cease such occupation. So you had a lot of people trying to produce counterfeits from then, right? A recommitment of the bill against logwood from 1607 in the House of Commons, according to the House of Commons Journal from that year, provides an illuminating insights into the sentiments in England about the trade in logwood and logwood dyes as early as that part of the 17th century. In that year, a petition from those that followed the bill against logwood to the House of Commons on the ground that logwood was continually brought in, kept, prepared, and used within the realm of England to the hindrance of the king and his customs, and to the wrong of his subjects, who by the deceitful dyes for pure colors, hindrance to merchandising and shipping, and the employment of the poor should be made a felony. In other words, there was a significant illicit trade in logwood dyes happening, particularly because there was a ban by the Spanish crown who wanted to control and monopolize this trade. I think even decades later, logwood remained a problem in England. For instance, in 1630, Charles I issued a proclamation that no silk shall be dyed of any other black but Spanish black. One study said that the purpose of this was possibly to continue to outlaw the use of logwood in England and require the English to purchase their blacks from Spain dyed with logwood. So there you have it. The problem with logwood in England, I think, in my view, was that it was widely believed that the dye from the wood could not be made steadfast. So in other words, it couldn't hold, the colors faded pretty quickly after any fabrics were dyed. And therefore, logwood remained banned in Britain until 1662, 7 years after England captured Jamaica from Spain, and about when the outlook of the English crown towards privateering and buccaneering in the Caribbean was beginning to change, a discussion about which I'll come to shortly. These prohibitions, in my view, coupled with the trade limitations by the Spanish crown, would arguably have served as a strong disincentive to British privateers, or buccaneers as we prefer, to engage in cutting logwood in the Bay of Honduras, indeed anywhere in the Spanish Main for that matter. That is, unless the privateers wish to release any such quantities of shipments of captured or illicitly cut logwood to a certain Richard Giles and his deputies, who had been granted a patent by the English king, along with a yearly fee to take all such false and deceivable goods on arrival in English ports. At this time, and this is before the late 1660s to the 1670s, the markets for logwood in Boston and New York had not yet developed. So this was not an option for any of the buccaneers come logwood cutters. So for those of you who like the Boston Celtics, you all should know that there was a very strong trade relationship between Boston and Belize involving logwood. And there is at this time, you can visit a certain church in Boston where there's a pew inside of that church that's dedicated to the baymen, the logwood cutters of the baymen. In 1675, about when logwood trade was taking off, one Edward Cranfield of Port Royal, Jamaica, reported that in the space of 2.5 months, 17 New England vessels, or 17 vessels from Boston, had touched at the port bung for Campeche for logwood. Sorry. Notably, this did not involve Belize, and the connection between Belize and Boston and New York seemed to have developed a bit later, after like 1715, I think, and that is when that started to develop. There were further problems with selling any logwood onto the market in England, mainly London, during this period, as the Lord Mayor of London had been requested by the Lord Treasurer of the English government at the time to confiscate any such wood in the possession of Giles and his men, and to burn them in some public place within the city. I think to make matters more difficult, logwood seized by privateers fetched much lower prices in Europe, around only 9 pounds per ton, and even lower than the Nicaragua wood or the bloodwood, which sold at around 30 pounds per ton. But compare that to the 100 pounds per ton that was being made by the English crown, because it had the monopoly and limited the production of it, it was able to command those high prices. But that is not to say that the Englishmen were not early cutting logwood from the Bay of Honduras near Belize. As in 1593, a privateer named James Langton captured 6.5 tons of logwood aboard a ship sailing from Puerto Caballo, south of Honduras. And it was believed that the logwood in that ship came from Belize. But Englishmen, it appears, were not yet intent on settling on the Bay of Honduras. They were just cutting and exploiting the wood that was available there. The impact of the prohibitions against the import of logwood in England extended beyond placing the English textile sector at a significant disadvantage. And in my opinion, in my analysis, very likely this incentivized English woodcutters from the logwood cutting. Significantly, I think it also discouraged English buccaneers from turning to logwood cutting, at least in any serious or permanent way, because there just wasn't enough money in this trade at the time to warrant such a change or shift. And after 1650, the price of logwood started to decline precipitously anyway. The fact that in 1630, the Providence Island Company, which had a patent again from the king to set up a colony in Providence Island, abandoned its plans for exporting logwood from Tortuga off the coast of Haiti, and seemed that occurrence, I think, seems to support the analysis that there just wasn't enough money in logwood for any of these buccaneers or pirates to switch to cutting logwood. However, being pirates and corsairs, if they happened onto a ship of logwood, certainly what they would have done was attempt to offload that for a ransom or for a payment, alongside any other valuables, including ships that they would have captured. I think that no other privateer other than the mythical Peter Wallace settled anywhere in the Bay of Honduras seems to underscore the point that during the 16th century and early part of the 17th century, the logwood trade was not appealing to privateers and buccaneers, at least not sufficiently to entice them to establish any settlements there. Of course, other buccaneers turned logwood cutters like Luke Hawthorne later retired to Black River in the Mosquito Kingdom in Nicaragua to cut logwood. But this happened at a much later date and after the logwood trade had long been enjoying its golden period. It's more towards the end of that golden period. The implications of this reality for the Belize settlement is that it is highly unlikely that any English buccaneers would have turned to logwood cutting and settled on the territory in the 1630s, undoubtedly even before 1660. The other conditions being right for this to happen notwithstanding. In other words, the fact that as the 𝗏𝗲𝗃𝗶𝘀𝗶𝗶 and Schumann had said, that it was right because the conditions were right. It still didn't happen. In other words, I think although the Spanish naval fort at Salamanca de Bacalar had been finally abandoned after 1652, the likelihood of a settlement in the Bay of Honduras being established before the logwood trade had started to intensify in late 1670s would have been very, very slim. However, several developments in the second half of the century, particularly from the early 1660s and certainly after 1670, made this eventuality significantly more attractive to English buccaneers. Next slide, please. Firstly, in 1655, a British expedition under Sir William Penn and General Robert Venables captured Jamaica from the Spanish, transforming the nature of English presence in the Indies and reshaping its relationship with Spain there. Prior to this, English settlements in the region had been limited to just a few settlements, including the short-lived Providence Island and the Bay Islands. As Professor Carla Gardina Pestana, professor of history at the University of California, contends, English occupation of Jamaica provided England with the opportunity to extract resources from colonies, and Jamaica, which had stands of logwood and mahogany and had been its first had its first shipment of logwood sent out in 1611, now stood poised to facilitate further exports of the commodity from the Spanish Main, so from the Yucatan area or from the Bay of Honduras. I think it's significant that the English colonial officials in Jamaica were unwilling or refused to enforce the English Crown prohibitions against logwood training because it was, I think the buccaneers could make use of the illicit trade. As Sir Thomas Modiford, governor of Jamaica from 1664 to 1671, argued, the logwood trade was the only diversion for privateers that would keep them from raiding Spanish ports and preying on other shipping. In 1670, Modiford estimated that there were around 12 vessels in the harbor at Jamaica engaged in logwood cutting, and around the same time, the governor of Campeche had complained that the English ships were carrying off logwood from Yucatan. Notably, these complaints by the governor of Campeche referred to logwood cutting and shipping happening in the Bay of Campeche and not from any settlement in the Bay of Honduras. By the early 1670s, the presence of British logwood cutters in the Yucatan had become a problem for Spain, and in 1674, the Queen Regent of Spain issued a royal cedula calling for logwood cutters in Honduras and Yucatan to be punished. Following this, the Spanish Guardia Costa started operating from Bacalar, seized many ships operating out of Jamaica and accused them of carrying on illicit trade, which essentially meant that the logwood trade. Nevertheless, the illicit trade in Jamaica continued to develop and was increasingly tolerated between 1672 and about 1700. In 1671, the governor of Jamaica, Thomas Lynch, who had replaced Modiford, estimated that the English logwood cutters had processed more than 40,000 pounds of logwood through Port Royal. So a significant amount of wood was now starting to pass through Port Royal. Renewed English interest in the logwood trade started growing from around the middle of the 17th century. And in June 1649, by an order of Parliament, the Committee of the Navy was requested to take consideration of the business of logwood and to report their opinions to the House. Members of Parliament in England had been facing growing pressures from the companies of merchant adventurers, drapers, dyers, felt makers, etc., to remove prohibitions on logwood, as this was necessary for dyeing woolen cloths, cotton, and line, and all threads, as well as leather and hats. And in 1662, this prohibition was lifted. This eventuality, I think, in my analysis, would have directly reshaped the outlook of English buccaneers towards logwood cutting and the logwood trade in the Bay of Honduras and other parts of Yucatan. Next slide, please. Secondly, in the late 1650s and early 1660s, mordants of natural dyes were introduced and new stabilizing techniques developed and applied, which made the dye from logwood more stable. But not before, and this not happened before 1664. Not surprisingly, this coincided, or rather contributed to increased activity by English woodcutters in Yucatan and the Bay of Campeche, where the bulk of logwood trade was then centered. Of course, English officials tacitly encouraged this happening and had been doing so since the mid-1650s, which enabled an illicit trade in logwood to develop in Campeche. Within a few decades, English logwood cutters were operating along the entire coast of Yucatan and the Bay of Honduras. And this period, in my view, would have been ripe for the establishment of an English settlement in British Honduras, especially considering that the territory had some of the best stands of logwood and was generally considered remote. In other words, it was out of sight of Spanish officials. Thirdly, in 1660, England passed the navigation laws and logwood was listed as an enumerated product, which meant essentially that any logwood destined for the English market could only be shipped to English ports in English bottoms or in English vessels. Barbara and Victor Wilmot Thomas argued that this did not have any effect on the logwood trade from Belize, and thus this trade continued apace as the settlement was not covered by the Act. Still, in a case taken up by the Board of Trade, the board recommended to the Lord Justices that the Act laid greater restraint on colonial than English ships, and thus any vessel contravening this Act should be prosecuted when it arrived in England, and orders to this effect were accordingly issued to the commissioners of customs. I think that situation notwithstanding, the situation was alleviated in 1662 when Charles removed the penalties against the use of logwood. In other words, when the prohibition was lifted, that alleviated the position. Now it became a lot more attractive for perhaps to look at logwood as an alternative trade. Charles II declared that the ingenious industry of modern times had made the dyers of England the art of fixing colors made of logwood, and therefore he gave, as a result of that, permission to import and use it for dyeing. After that, the import of logwood into England increased substantially. From 1662 to 1774, the value of logwood imports into England from the Indies and Spanish Main rose from around 3,000 to 167,000, and in 1715, Britain imported more than 5,863 tons of logwood. In 1662, around the time when Englishmen from Jamaica started cutting logwood in Campeche and the Yucatan. So it is plausible then that a settlement at British Honduras in the Bay of Honduras could have been established then. However, buccaneering and privateering out of Jamaica was in full swing during this time, and therefore any permanent shift into logwood cutting again would not have been likely. Next slide, please. Fourthly, and this is related to the previous point, the Treaty of Madrid of 1667, which became the Treaty of Godolphin in 1670, finally brought an end to peacetime buccaneering and piracy. And when the profitability of privateering or buccaneering dried up, this in my view is what pushed many former buccaneers to take up logwood cutting and harvesting. By this treaty, Spain recognized England's holding in the Caribbean, including Jamaica, and in return for this, the English pledged to cease giving commissions in peacetime to buccaneers who raided Spanish shipping and ports. This Treaty of Godolphin is notable for excluding mention of the settlement of British Honduras or the settlement in the Bay of Honduras, suggesting that either the Spanish and English officials at Jamaica were unaware of any logwood settlement and activity there, or the English officials, especially those in Jamaica, were aware but kept quiet about this, or that there were no settlements located there, at least not any substantial ones to bother the Spanish. Next slide, please. Following the unfolding of these myriad but related developments, the full set of conditions were now, in my analysis, in place to tempt the swarms of buccaneers and pirates that had flooded into Jamaica after the island was captured from Spain to shift to logwood cutting and trading. Simply put, logwood cutting was now more appealing, but still illicit. Thus, it was unsurprising that after 1670, British presence in the Lagud areas of Yucatan increased significantly, and numerous new settlements were established in Cape Catoche, the Bay of Campeche. The impetus for this increase came from two additional sources: a resolution in 1666 by the Council of Jamaica to grant letters of marque against the Spaniard, which would easily allow access to logwood and other commodities, and a letter from Governor Montford in Jamaica in 1670 encouraging the whole logwood trade, as this could become English, with 20% of the profit for the king, per ton for the king. Consequently, by the first half of the 1670s, the trickle of buccaneers and privateers that settled in Laguna de Terminos had increased so much so that by 1672, 900 or more English logwood cutters were living and cutting logwood in Campeche. In the settlements in the Belize territory, as Schumann contends, the numbers definitely increased substantially during that time. Next slide, please. Despite the remoteness of the Belize territory, I think, and difficulties with navigating its coastline, the bay must have been appealing to the English logwood cutters, as it was believed to hold some of the best logwood stands in the Yucatan area. Nonetheless, there was no mention of any logwood cutting activity there by English officials, including those in Jamaica, when Thomas Montford wrote to Secretary Lord Arlington in 1670 stating that more than a dozen former buccaneering vessels were shipping logwood from the Bay of Campeche and Mosquito. So they're talking about Yucatan and Nicaragua, but not the Bay of Honduras or not Belize. However, this did not mean that logwood cutting was not already happening and a settlement established in Belize. We just don't have evidence of that. As Thomas Lynch, who succeeded Montford as governor of Jamaica, stated to the secretary to the Council for Plantations in a letter, the best logwood in the region grew in thickets on calcareous stops in the morose and swampish area near the coast. He was, of course, referring to the settlement of Belize. And given that, this knowledge about the availability of the choicest logwood stands being in Belize, it is clear that if a settlement had not yet been established, certainly that logwood cutting had already started there. This is probably what William Coxon, the pirate turned logwood cutter, had been referring to in 1672, when he informed Lynch that Englishmen had been cutting logwood in the eastern coast of Yucatan and had been doing so for 2.5 to 3 years. I think if Coxon was referring to the Belize territory, then it suggests that a settlement had existed there from around 1669 or thereabouts. In any event, by the 1670s, Belize had become another important center of logwood extraction, and even more so in the second decade of the 1700s, so by middle of around 1715, 1718, Belize became really important as a center of logwood and cutting that time. Montford's contention that the cutting in uninhabited places had been happening before the signing of the Madrid Treaty suggests that if this included Belize, then it confirms Coxon's report at the settlement that there was a settlement there by 1670. The situation at logwood had changed so rapidly that the English officials did not have time to come to an arrangement with Spain over the logwood trade. And the Spanish were upset that the English had started to monopolize the trade. And following several complaints by the governor of Yucatan about this, in 1679, English officials in Jamaica, and he informed in 1679 English officials in Jamaica that the Spanish would not be making any concessions over the logwood trade. To appease Spain, therefore, the English outlawed the logwood trade, and for a few years, from about 1674, the colonial officials in Jamaica had been discouraged to engage those in trade, but not before Charles II had requested the Council on Foreign Trade Plantations to solve the problem on the logwood tree. This involved the English philosopher John Locke, who was at the time secretary of to the Council of Trade and Plantations, and who was also personally involved with English colonies in America. Between 1668 and 71, Locke was secretary to the Lord Proprietor of Carolina and a member of the English Board of Trade from 1696 to 1700. Locke also had investments in the Royal African Company, whose business was slaves, as well as in the Company of Merchant Adventurers that carried on trade in the West Indies. In response to the request from Charles II, Locke developed the res nullius argument, which held that all things empty, in other words, unoccupied lands, remained the common property of all mankind until they were put to some kind of agricultural use. And in this way, that opened the way for legitimating English presence in the New World. Thus, the issue of logwood cutting moved from being simply an English rights to cut the tree to a matter of English sovereignty over the lands where the tree grew, lands that were claimed by Spain. Next slide, please. Let me turn briefly to the issue of privateers and buccaneers, and I'm starting to wrap up now, that purportedly shifted from their plundering and raiding to logwood cutting. The nature of buccaneering activities suggests that the individuals involved in that vocation are not the type that possess any impulses for setting up settlements, except for where it involved temporary bases to facilitate their plunder and their pillaging. Nor would they have been spontaneously inclined to switch to logwood cutting. As Professor Jesse Cromwell, author of the paper Life in the Margins, Ex-Buccaneers and Campeche Logwood Periphery, stated, the sinew populations were composed of individuals who were neither planters nor slaves, but instead sailors, soldiers, and smugglers. Cromwell rightly concluded that the logwood cutters preferred to live off the grid of the British Caribbean society, but that they refused to give up their buccaneering lifestyles. Another scholar argued as much when he stated that Drake and Hawkins, the renowned pirates, were not interested, privateers generally were not interested in establishing colonies. Nonetheless, Professor David Head posits in his book, The Golden Age of Piracy, that European challenges to Spanish hegemony in the New World began with the maritime marauding, and their raids eventually led to buccaneer settlements in places usually along the coast. Next slide, please. The coastline along the settlement of British Honduras certainly had enough remote coves and inlets that would have made it attractive to privateers and buccaneers operating in the area. However, as the Bulma Thomases and Schumann have argued elsewhere, any English buccaneers would have been largely prevented from setting up camp in the Belize territory, while the Spanish naval fort at Salamanca de Bacalar was operational at full capacity and actively patrolling the waterways. Indeed, to help protect against the external aggression, the Spanish had created a coastal defense system of vigías, or nautical warnings on the northern and eastern coast of Yucatan. And this had proven ineffective against several maritime assaults and certainly against the pirates. They don't pay attention to any warning systems. They bypass that. And therefore, the Spanish ended up outsourcing some of the protection of the Yucatan area to guardacosta's work by Dutch and Irish buccaneers. And between 1671 and 1674, these hired guns seized 75 English vessels operating in Yucatan and Bay of Honduras. So you're looking at the dates here. 1670s is when you're beginning to see activity out of the Bay of Honduras and mention of this in the history. The fact that there are no historical reports or documentation about Spanish naval forces attacking any settlements in Belize prior to 1695 or 1696 seems to support the view that there were no significant logwood settlements in a long period before this time. In fact, it wasn't until the English logwood cutters started relocating from the Bay of Campeche to Bay of Honduras in this mid-1750, 1718, that the Spanish forces launched more serious raids on the settlement at Belize. For instance, in 1718, there was an attack from Petén in the interior, which drove the woodcutters to the coast, and again in 1722 and 1726, when many of the logwood cutters were expelled from British Honduras. Next slide, please. Instead, prior to Jamaica's capture, the English buccaneers operated from temporary bases in the Indies where they could attack Spanish shipping, and after Jamaica fell into English hands, the English buccaneers operated openly from there as they could freely trade their captured booty. By one account, Kingston Harbor, Port Royal, had grown fabulously wealthy from Spanish gold and silver plundered by buccaneers and was the busiest port in English America. Next slide. This is not surprising, as not only was buccaneering encouraged by different English governors of Jamaica because of the defense and commerce this provided to the English there, but buccaneering or privateering was used by the English as a policy tool against Spain during the Anglo-Spanish War that started in 1654 over a commercial rivalry about who could access what or conduct what trade in the New World. Thus, it was customary for the English colonial officials in Jamaica to issue what were termed letters of marque to encourage attacks on Spanish shipping and commercial interests. Governor Thomas Modiford, for instance, issued letters of marque to buccaneers, including one to the infamous pirate Henry Morgan, under the pretext that this was necessary to secure Jamaica until Spain recognized the island as an English colony. When Thomas Lynch succeeded Modiford as governor of Jamaica, he brought with him a vision for England becoming the storehouse of logwood for all Europe, which would be worth, he thought, £100,000 per year per annum to the trade and customs of England. Although logwood now traded at £15 per ton, the volume of trade had increased to several thousand tons annually, compared to the 500 tons annually during the period of the Spanish Crown's monopoly of the logwood trade. Moreover, following the repeal of the ban against logwood in England a few years earlier, the demand for logwood had been growing in that country. Lynch was aware that logwood, which at first had been readily available by the seaside, now could only be found 4 or 5 miles up into the country, and therefore logwood cutters had to build houses there to keep themselves and their provisions safe from the sun and protected from the rain. The critical development regarding English buccaneering in the Indies began with the Treaty of Madrid in 1677, and then again in 1670 as the Treaty of Godolphin. Because by that treaty, Spain agreed to recognize England's holdings in the Caribbean, including Jamaica, in return for English ceasing to support privateering or buccaneering commissions during peacetime. Following this, the market for riches from buccaneering closed, and former buccaneers and pirates were now forced to consider option for earning a livelihood. This preceding discussion shows that new conditions had unfolded in the Indies that would have served as a strong enticement to the English buccaneers to take up logwood cutting. A letter from the Board of Trade to George I pointed out that the Anglo-Spanish Treaty of 1667 had led the way to a great increase in the number of logwood cutters. Indeed, from that point on, I think the stream of ex-buccaneers that had been trickling into the Laguna de Terminos and Bay of Campeche to cut logwood started to snowball. At the same time, encouragements from the English colonial governors in Jamaica resulted in some going to the bays to cut wood. Next slide, please. The final point I wanted to make is that the contraband trade with the Spanish main, so with Spanish America, was really important in what happened in terms of setting up a settlement in the Bay of Honduras. After Jamaica was captured in 1655, a flourishing by the English in 1655, a flourishing contraband trade between the island and Spanish America developed, with much of that trade taking place through the settlement of Belize in the Bay of Honduras, from where goods were transshipped through Lake Isabel. Although the harbor at Belize was only secure for smaller vessels, ideally any that had I think 20 feet of draft or less, and the approach to the harbor was tricky because of the reef and coastline, it was still the most satisfactory shipping route into Central America. After Central American independence from Spain in 1821, Belize emerged as the main entrepot for illegal trade with Central America. But illicit trade was an endemic feature of British activity in the New World in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the largest and most important of the 3 branches of Anglo-Spanish commerce that bound Jamaica to Spanish America. During that period, the Spanish Crown monopoly of the logwood trade, English buccaneering continually harassed and plundered Spanish shipping, and the buccaneers often raided ships carrying logwood, increasingly so from the 1660s from logwood coming out of the Yucatan. The Spanish were aware of this illicit trade in logwood by the English buccaneers, but largely neglected to protect Spanish subjects in Campeche and the Laguna de Terminos. Next slide, please. English illicit trade in the Indies continued after the union of England and Scotland to form Great Britain in 1707. And under the Asiento Treaty of 1713, contraband trade between Britain and Spanish America expanded significantly. The South Sea Company was then set up by the British government, was heavily involved in contraband trade, and that company used the legal sale of African slaves to shield their illicit commerce with the Spanish colonies. Given Jamaica's position in the Caribbean as a gateway, it was really valuable to the Spanish Empire in the New World. It was heavily used by the South Sea Company as its main center of both legal and illicit activities in the Indies. The rise of contraband trade with Spanish America was arguably an inevitable result of the way Spain organized its colonial trade with the New World. That was as a closed system of commerce. But long before the asiento, the British had been carrying on a contraband trade with the Spanish colonies. But after 1655, Jamaica became an important player for England in the smuggling of goods to the Kingdom of Guatemala and later the United Provinces of Central America. And Jamaica's contraband trade continued to be organized primarily out of Port Royal until 1692. One scholar mentioned that even after 2 centuries of Spanish colonial control, there were only 2 main routes from the Atlantic into Guatemala or Central America, through Mexico and through British Honduras. Much of this illicit trade from Jamaica with Central America was conducted with the United Provinces of Central America was conducted through Belize, and by the middle of the 18th century, the flow of goods had become a tsunami. As Robert Naylor found, after Jamaica's capture by Cromwell's forces, British adventurers began to exploit not only the variety of valuable woods in Belize, but also carried on significant illicit trade with the Kingdom of Guatemala. This illicit trade through Belize started off small, utilizing temporary bases along the coast where goods were transferred to smaller boats, including pit pans, and were then on ship through Lake Isabel and the 𝗕𝗲𝗪𝙧𝙞 region of Guatemala. It was the knowledge of these feeder shipping routes for the illicit trade that was conducted through Belize that made in the 1800s the settlement or allowed the settlement to emerge as the main entrepôt for formal British trade with the United Provinces of Central America. And that was what transformed really the settlement from an outpost of British Empire into a bridgehead for British formal trade with the region. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the outpost and the settlement would have grown highly effective in penetrating the Spanish America with illicit goods. The illicit nature of this trade would have been highly appealing to English buccaneers, more so after 1670, after the Treaty of Godolphin outlawed buccaneering activities or privateering activities. I think both buccaneers and other interlopers started cutting logwood during that period when there were lulls in the contraband trade and when they were not carrying on any privateering or piracy raids. The story of John Coxon, the buccaneer who became logwood cutter, illustrates what likely occurred. Between 1669 and 1689, Coxon, by his own admission, fluctuated between cutting logwood and serving as a commissioned privateer to hunt down English logwood cutters illegally cutting logwood. Last slide, please. So my conclusions is, I've argued this evening that the historical revisionism related to the origins of the settlement of British Honduras in the Bay of Honduras, initiated by Barbara and Professor Victor Bulmer-Thomas back in 2016, discrediting the claim that the English settlement in Belize was first founded in 1638 by a Scottish buccaneer named Wallis, a view which seems to be supported by the leading historian Belize Guatemala territorial dispute, Assad Schumann, is not only long overdue, but also complicated, largely because of the lack of historical documentation about the settlement origins. The Bulmer-Thomases posited that the conditions were right from about 1642 when the Spanish naval fort at Salamanca de Bacalar was sacked by El Mulatto for the settlement to be established. But Schumann believed that it was more likely from about 1652 when the fort had been permanently abandoned. I agree with these authors that the conditions were right during this period, but I add that not all of the conditions to facilitate an English settlement being settled in the Belize territory were in place until perhaps the mid to late 1660s, more towards late 1660s, 1670. That the first logwood settlement on the coast of the Spanish Main was not established until 1662 in Cape Catoche, strongly suggests that the settlement of British Honduras did not occur until after this time. In my analysis, the settlement in Belize likely occurred around 1668, 1669, though there's no clear evidence of the existence of any settlement in the Bay until 1682. To support these historically revisionist claims, I showed firstly that the logwood trade was for myriad reasons not economically and financially attractive to entice buccaneers to give up their plundering and marauding ways to cut logwood until after 1667, definitely after 1670. And therefore, there is a strong likelihood that ex-buccaneers would not have established any permanent settlements in British Honduras earlier than this period, much less in 1638 or any of the earlier periods that have been put forward. I also showed that the circumstances were not fully right until 1668 to 1670 thereabouts, when the Anglo-Spanish treaties sought to permanently suppress privateering and force English buccaneers to shift to logwood cutting as an alternative form of useful engagement. By this time, not only had the price of logwood fallen to around 50 pounds per ton, but the main center of logwood activity had emerged in the Laguna de Terminus area of the Bay of Campeche. Still, if any buccaneers had bases on the Belize territory that were close to or had easy access to stands of logwood that could be exploited, these bases could have been made more permanent. In other words, it is likely that such bases would now have been used for more sustained periods during the year, thereby taking on the characteristics of true settlements in the sense of being permanent communities. Finally, I also showed that the contraband trade from Jamaica with the Spanish Main, or I argued that the contraband trade from Jamaica with the Spanish Main that developed after Jamaica had been captured by the British was highly likely a significant factor in persuading the buccaneers and to consider establishing permanent settlements in the Bay of Honduras. The combination of sustained illicit trade with the Spanish America would have been a powerful enticement, especially if this could be supplemented with logwood cutting and the logwood trade. Notwithstanding the above arguments, I think logwood was indeed the raison d'etre for the settlement's founding. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. David Gomez, and thank you so much our viewers that have been sharing their comments and sharing their questions in the chat. I would now like to call on Director of the Institute for Social and Cultural Research, Mr. Rolando Cocom, as he is going to be moderating the Q&A segment of our program this evening. Rolando, are you there?
Hi, April, and hi, Dr. Gomez and the full team of organizers and attendees. Thank you so much for joining us this evening or early morning where you are. I just want to say a few words and just to acknowledge, first of all, David, for your willingness to be able to take the time and effort and sacrifice to be able to share your perspectives this early on. You mentioned that a book is forthcoming on your thesis, and we are looking forward to that. But it's not very common that a Belizean is so willing to come on and speak before actually releasing the book, no? But we appreciate that, and we appreciate the fact that you have devoted so much years of your life to understanding these important issues. I know that there are a huge number of persons joining us on this Zoom call, which makes it a bit challenging for everybody to speak. So what I would ask is if you could keep your questions very concise as much as possible. I see some good colleagues and friends and some new ones as well, so I'm very glad that you're able to join us. At ISCR NICH, our goal is to create platforms like these, and we're happy to have collaborators and the experts who are willing to share. So please remain tuned as we offer another opportunity where David will be also expounding upon these ideas that have developed in the first part. And I want to thank him because he has helped to bring some specifics as to why the empire ended up shaping Belize the way it did at the time it did. And we really appreciate that because as Gomez is highlighted in the presentation, oftentimes we just throw out a blur figure or a huge range of years as to when the settlement could have been established. You could say from the 1600s, or you take the 1630s, and really we miss the substance as to why we're declaring these points as the time when the settlement started. And so I think he has helped to substantiate that it's really until maybe the 1660s, 1670s that there's sufficient multiple sources that point to that direction of a more permanent settlement, British settlement in the area. As one of our attendees pointed out, we must accept obviously the strong continuities of our Maya ancestors living in this land before then. And so I now take this opportunity for more questions from our attendees. I see some hands being lifted up, but I think there was one early on, and I think I kind of hinted to that already when we use the term settlement. how we're referring to non-indigenous people. But I think that's taken for granted. Dr. Gomez said we obviously we do accept that the Maya have long settled Belize, and I think that's also just part of our post-colonial critique, no? How we address a land that was certainly not empty before the British and in fact before the Spaniards began making their visitas into Belize. And just curious as well on that point, Dr. Gomez, just maybe what the archival sources you came across in terms of the early Spanish attempts of exploring this settlement, this territory, while they encountered Maya communities. I don't know to what extent that factored into the debates, and maybe it's more in the details that you could share at another point. But if you could just maybe start with that, and then we could maybe go on with, I see Gian Vasquez and Cesar Ross as well interested in raising their hands and raising a question.
Yeah, Rolando, thank you for that question. That's a really important one. I mean, I always wondered, and I still wonder, was that the Spanish, if they knew that there were significant stands of valuable logwood in Belize, why that was not exploited? Why Laguna de Terminos, the Bay of Campeche? And I think what happened was that the Spanish way of operating as colonial explorers was very brutal. They did not have they did not make any friends with any of the indigenous populations within Belize. And the Belize coastline around the Belize district area, so what became the settlement, was not not a very nice area to be in. It was full of mosquitoes, it was swampy, it was like that. When you look at the Bay of Campeche and those other places, they were much nicer, much easier. It's still swampy, but you had easier access to better areas. The shipping lanes were not as difficult to navigate. The relationship between the Spanish and Belize in the early periods, and why they never actually settled here, I think was fully addressed in the book by Mavis Campbell, or at least made an earnest attempt to do that. And it suggests that yes, indeed, that there was no support from any of the Mayan or indigenous populations living in the region. I still don't understand how it was that the British were able to forge a relationship with the Maya, because the Maya people, for me, would have been at that point starting to figure, wait, these people are killing us off, they're attacking us all the time. So what the British did, I don't know. Maybe that's something I need to go back and look at, and to see if I could find anything in the sources that explains that more clearly to me. I know Matthew Renstall and others have done quite a bit of work around this area, so I need to go back and look at their studies, at their scholarship a bit more, to see what's there. But the fact was that there just were not any Spanish settlements in the Bay of Honduras, and the pirates, the buccaneers, used a lot of bases off the coast to operate. These were mainly from the Keys, not on the mainland side, because it didn't make sense coming all the way into, or trying to navigate in within the reef to do so. But they operated from the Keys, and there is evidence that they were off Turneffe Islands, that they occupied there at one point to attack any of the Spanish shipping that was sailing up and down in the channels. So.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Gomez, for that insight. Maybe we go to, I don't know, Gian, you mentioned you had a question first. You can
Yes,
go ahead.
I do. So I can go and ask my question?
Yes, Gian, if you don't mind, maybe just say a few words about who you are, and I'll ask this for all the attendees, just to kind of contextualize where we're talking to. Just mention maybe you're a lecturer.
Gian Vasquez, lecturer of history at St. John's College, Junior College, bachelor's in history.
Brilliant.
So the question is, you constantly mention buccaneers, and settlement of buccaneers. How does the activities of Bartholomew Sharp, John Coxon, Edward Teach factor into your revision of when piracy ends and settlement starts? And why is it that you do not use the arrival of Africans as a labor source to factor into the development of settlement?
Gian, thanks for that. That's a very important question. I think what I was focusing on in my research was just the revisionism around the formation of the date. I don't look specifically or a lot at the type of labor sources that came with that. Nigel Boland and Asad Schumann have done brilliantly in researching that issue, and they've published books on that. And I think there are other sources that provide a lot of that. The African slaves that came to Belize and that worked in the logging camps here, though, was a factor, and it was a factor in terms of the ability of those settlements to then expand and become sustainable, in the sense that they were able to be permanent for a much longer period of time. What I did find in other research was that throughout Central America, or throughout in the 1800s, the Guatemalans had tried to use African slaves and Caribs and coming through Honduras and like that, to see if they could have them populate these areas around the 𝗏𝗲𝗃𝗏𝗀𝗏 Dulce, so that they could then make it viable for them to have ports that operate and like that. Personally, I did not look much into the issue of African slave labor as a factor in the expansion of any settlements, but African slave labor would not have been available yet, at least as far as I've seen, in terms of this settlements being established, more so for the expansion. With regard to the question about all the famous pirates that you mentioned, I think those were individuals or personalities who really enjoyed piracy. They loved the life on the high seas. They love attacking ships. They love the status that came from that, especially when they were able to use Port Royal and Jamaica as a base for selling all the goods they plundered. That tapered off when it became illegal when the English made it illegal to engage in piracy anymore. Incidentally, the Netflix or Prime series Black Sails just provides a really excellent look into the history of piracy and what happened there. Those pirates were all at one point in time had transited through Belize, or had operated from Belize, or had bases in Belize, or had been in Belize. But they were not significant figures in terms of establishing any permanent settlement here. As I said, I think what happened was you had the confluence of these multiple events happening. You had piracy being outlawed, so then all the buccaneers or pirates were forced to find another thing to way of earning their living. The prohibition against the logwood trade was lifted in England in 1662. And then you had the fact that the logwood itself was beginning to take off as a trade during that time. So those three factors, I think, had to combine together for it to really work. But I think what really took it over the hump was the fact that the Jamaicans were starting to run a massive illicit trade with Central America. Now, for pirates, buccaneers, what was interesting was their ability to make monies from that. And then if they had more permanent settlements set up in the bay, then they could conduct that trade. And then when that trade wasn't working really well, or had low periods, then they could carry on with cutting logwood to supplement that. I think the analysis for the research for me, and the analysis shows that is very likely what happened. And those are those factors had to come together at that point, and it did around the late 1660s. But Teach and Blackbeard and the other pirates passed through, but they were not critical to the settlement's establishment.
Thank you, Dr. Gomez. Mr. Assessor, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much, Orlando. And thank you, Dr. Gomez. It's always refreshing to revisit. It's some years now that I've been disconnected from much history and history work, no? I was a lecturer of history and anthropology at the University of Belize for some years. But one thing that I was waiting to hear, and it picks up from what Gian mentions, I think it is Dr. Angel Cal in his writings that reference, and Dr. Cal does a lot of research in the Yucatan and Spanish archives.
That's correct.
Who reference a diary of a Friar Delgado who travels through the geographic area we now call Belize.
Yes.
And refers to sometime in the 1650s or so, coming across a settlement or a temporary settlement as such, where the Bartholomew Sharp was located, likely off one of the islands, maybe St. George's Caye or so, no?
𝗥𝗲𝘃𝗚.
And maybe.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're correct. Dr. Cal has done a lot of research in this area. I think I tried to draw a distinction between what would have been a temporary settlement and a permanent one. So temporary as in the sense of it that it was not a permanent community. It was set up and habitated for an extended period of time, even several months, maybe a year and a half, but then would have been broken down, disbanded as those guys moved on to conduct or carry on piracy and the marauding and plundering elsewhere. What I was looking at was what was the establishment of a permanent settlement, or what became permanent. So I know 𝗥𝗲𝘃𝗏 or St. George's Caye is relevant to the history of Belize in that it became really the first area from which Belize, a settlement was established. But I think there were gaps in between the different pirates who used that as a base. I do need to go back and look at the research from Dr. Cal and his publications to see if there's additional information there that perhaps could shift the date again for us here. What's important, though, I think, is the fact that we're now able to establish that 1638 was absolutely not the start of any permanent settlement of Belize. It was not the start of the English colony in Belize. That was at a later date. And all of the conditions would not have been right in the 1650s even, because you still had logwood is still a prohibited a product for trade in England. The Spanish crown still had a monopoly of that trade. Privateering or buccaneering or piracy was still allowed and was happening at a really high level. So what probably happened was that you had Bartholomew Sharp and the others setting up there as a base, and then accessing or cutting any of the logwoods that were found on St. George's Caye. But the settlement or that island, certainly in my view, did not at that time become a permanent settlement.
Thank you, Dr. Gomez. I'm just speaking about settlement. There's a question around that from Jeremy Enriquez, who I must say has been very active on the Historical Society, and I think I appreciate persons like him who are trying to also gauge what is the public interest and what is called public history, and these all sort of heritage around Belize in the old days, and trying to tie that into oral tradition and academic sources. But he raised an important point around this notion around the settlement of Belize, and I don't know if in your research, Dr. Gomez, you were able to map out just these different distinctions around settlement of the Bay in Honduras versus settlement of Belize, or the British settlement, and if any of these names kind of clearly identified the colonial possession of this territory.
Yeah, I think thanks, Jerry, for the question. That's a really important one. I use settlement in the sense of any organized community taking on the characteristics of being a permanent community. and I speak precisely about the English or British activity in the area, recognizing that there were already long established indigenous populations. The Mayans were populated from top to bottom of Belize. So I'm not considering that. I'm talking about the colonial entry into the territory and what became then the first colonial enterprise in terms of what would later become British Honduras and then Belize for us. So I think, yeah, Jeremy's question is a really important one. And the way I try to distinguish it is by looking at whether or not any of these bases that were set up, did they at a particular point in time take on the characteristics of true settlements in the sense of being a permanent community? Was it continuous? Or did they set up the base, break it down, come back at another time, move to another base, or some other pirate group moved in and used that temporarily and then moved on again? So it's from that perspective. But yeah, I mean, there's a whole other scholarship around what happened between the colonial explorers and interlopers coming into the New World and displacing indigenous populations and then claiming that they were setting up settlements in areas that were undiscovered, unused, etc. And that's a whole rich literature on that. Interestingly, when Charles II requested from the board of the Council of Foreign Plantations and John Locke, he used the argument of res nullius not against indigenous communities because they were not in in these Europeans' eyes, these people were not meaningful, but they use it in the sense of how could they pry open or pry away territory or control of territory from the Spanish. And the res nullius argument is built around the old Roman law of that that says that land has to be in agricultural use for it to be considered valued or valuable. And so from that sense, then they were saying, well, the Spanish are not doing anything in Belize. They're not active here. They're not present here. They're not inhabiting. And just cutting logwood would have made it fulfill that res nullius argument. And so from that perspective, the English said, yeah, let's go ahead with that. And that is what was actually used by the British to legitimate their claims in the Americas, to say like, look, you are not doing anything here. This area is deserted, it's uninhabited, and we've come in and now we've given it useful. There's an entire book on that was written by a researcher, a PhD who now teaches at the Institute of the Americas, Sophie Brockman, that talks about how that was that all shaped up. Really, really interesting literature scholarship is starting to come through. There's another a professor doing work out of Boston that is looking at how Guatemala and the Central American communities came together, that has significant implications for Belize's territorial claims, issues like that. But yeah, I just sit and try to enjoy reading those. I'm not. I leave it to them to attack those angles. Yeah, no.
Thank you, Dr. Gomez. Thank you for sharing some of those insights in terms of other important work that is taking place. Due to time, maybe we'll take one more question. And while I see that person raise his or her hand, I would just add, no, I think one of the reflections that one could make from the entire proceedings and how it has relevance for us interpreting our current situation is just the role of the monarchy and the role of the state in creating societies, right? And so when we think about modern day economic problems and you know, just the lingering ideology of freehand capitalism, that capitalism will work without the influence of state actors, you know, that's totally disputed through the historical records. The state and the empire has always been influential in the shaping the society in terms of the economic trade that is taking place, has to do with interventions that happen at the state level. And I think it reminds us, I think, for the sake of the masses, to really pressure and lobby for better policies when we think about creating a fair and equitable society. And I just kind of wanted to kind of bring back some type of reflection that is possible from just all your references to the different initiations that happen at the monetary level and on all these boards that were established and that truly shape how people move and what was traded, even what was not traded in terms of the contraband trade that did occur and shape this colonial space. Is there somebody else that wants to ask a question orally or maybe through the Q&A? I know there were some questions in the chat that have to do with wanting to hear your perspectives on the ICJ. And we've already said that we kind of will want to just put that off maybe for another lecture.
Yeah. Rolando, just while any of the others attendees are figuring out their questions, I think following on what you just said, my research has shown, and I'm increasingly of the view that logwood was important for the English and then the British only insofar as it provided an opportunity for them to make territorial claims or of sovereignty over areas that would allow them to conduct this illicit trade and then formal trade to break up. They were not really interested in logwood, if I can be frank. What they wanted was to control and monopolize the trade of Spanish America. And my PhD research showed that that is exactly the reason why the British took so long to recognize Belize as a formal colony, because the illicit trade that was able to continue to be carried on and then formal trade through the settlement and through the Gulf of Dulce with Guatemala is what broke the Spanish monopoly and control. Eventually, well, it was one of the factors, right? But eventually, the British were only interested in preventing the expansion of French influence out of Mexico after Napoleon had installed his brother in control of Mexico City. And they had concocted plans of marching through all the way down to through Belize and then or through Mexico into Guatemala and taking over control of Central. So the British were interested in using logwood and using the space that provided for cementing their foothold in the region, not because they were interested in taking Belize as a territory.
Right.
They're essentially, the history shows that the British only laid territorial claims where it was prudent to do so. In other words, if they did not need to claim a territory to control the trade, they did not claim the territory. But if they had to prevent another European or colonial power from doing that, they would do so if that also gave them the opportunity to control the trade. And that's what happened in the case of Belize. So,
David, that's a clever argument. And I think you saved that argument right towards the end when we have to now expect the second one, because there's just so many questions there. It's just the level of consciousness toward in terms of the records speak to this conscious, deliberate strategy, or is this implied over time from you looking at just a large amount of data sets? But I think that's a good teaser for probably another session with you. So I don't see a hand being raised, so I'll revert back. We have one more. We'll take Henry Anderson. Could you maybe just say a word about who you are, and then I'll revert back to April.
Just a Belizean who likes history. But David, I like the analogy that you or the analysis that you gave. And I could remember back in history class at UCB, and what we were taught, I think it was Leo Bradley pointing this out, that the BMN, I'll use that term, that we're here, we're happily carrying out the illicit trade, as you were saying. But when they started to get pressured from the Spanish, right, coming down.
Yeah.
And I think after they were sent to Cuba and locked up, and they decided, you know what, for us to continue this, then we need to ask the Crown for help. And that is what triggered it. So the people who were here were doing exactly what you said. And the reason the Crown got involved was when these guys said, listen, we need help. Doesn't take away from what you were saying, but I was just said that was Leo Bradley's interpretation to us way back then. No, but excellent work, by the way.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I think there is a kernel of truth to that. So it's interesting because the English colonial officials operating out of Jamaica were interested only in filling their own pockets. So they, even though the English crown and the Spanish crown had said that privateering or piracy is, can't do anything, we must desist from that. The guys were like, no, 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 no. We will continue to issue the letters of marque because the more ships they capture, the more they bring into Port Royal, the richer we can be, the better the life we can live, etc. And then the English, the crown really didn't really care about anything. It wanted to appease Spain because what it was really looking for was to see, well, if we appease Spain about this 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 issue and about this piracy issue, you think they would let us come in and do some of the trade? Of course, Spain was like, no, that's not going to happen. But it was at the time, I think all of Spanish America was starting to go through the period of the Bourbon reforms. And so you had a lot of changes taking place in the administrative structures that were that had been established in that area. But yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot. The Baymen, who had become a part of the Baymen, had reached out back to colonial officials, and they were like largely ignored. And they were like, guys, you have to try to do something on your own, and like that. It was interesting because when I was doing my research, it was then that I found out that I had members of my family, ancestors, who had participated in the Battle of St. George's Caye. And who were actively involved with logwood cutting and were actively involved with mahogany cutting. And so I've put it in the back of my mind to say, I have to do some research on them. And I have an idea about a historical novel, not so much a history book, but a historical novel about the woodcutters, because I think there was so much that I found when I was going through the archives about the depredations of these guys, how violent they were, how they treated women, how the African slaves or blacks existed in the society and like that. I thought, wow, there's just a rich amount of information here that certainly we could. I think for me, the idea really is ensuring that we, or the objective for me is really ensuring that our history begins to reflect what the research or what the historical material provides. And there's a lot that has to be corrected. A lot that has to be corrected. A lot of the books that we've were raised on and read like that drew information from places and just drew from what other people were saying. And people created a lot of myths about what was happened here, what didn't happen there, like that. But when you actually go through the archives, the archival material, it gives you a very different picture. Someone once said to me, so it's like, how come any of the other historians didn't see that before? I was like, well, a lot of it has to do with the analytical lens, the frame of that you're looking at. If I'm going through the material looking only to find information that helps to substantiate a British claim to Belize, a claim of sovereignty to Belize, I'm not going to look at any of the material that is economic or like that. But if I look at the economic material, when I read through those same archival materials, things jump out at me that any of the other researchers would not have seen or not have thought was interesting. I go back to the old teachings on history from E.H. Carr. History is made by winners. In other words, history is what historians choose or select to make important. So the events that are selected by the people writing is what makes particular issues important in history. And yeah, Henry, there's so much out there. I don't understand why we don't have more people trying to look at this and to do it. But yeah, Mr. Bradley was correct. Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. And I think that this first part kind of teaches us a little bit of the foundations that led to Belize's colonial society, but it also challenges us to think about the cultural attributes and behaviors that we've inherited because of this foundation, not just in socioeconomics, but in politics, in traditions, in the way we perceive our family tree. I would really like to know how you trace your family tree, Dr. Gomez. It's inspiring. A lot of people don't have that. And so it kind of shows you that you can once you take it upon yourself to do that research. So thank you so much for that. And I
Yeah, but
can't
he only
wait.
versus the British side, the English side.
I can't wait to hear the second part. But now I'm gonna toss it over to 𝗕𝗲𝙗𝙀𝙗𝗃, who is the History UB lecturer and also director of the Language and Cultural Institute, for his concluding remarks and to sign us off tonight. 𝗕𝗲𝙗𝙗.
Hi, good night to everybody. Thank you, Dr. Gomez, for such an enlightening and refreshing presentation. I think that we need to have a lot more discussions on history, for more discussion to be generated. I'm sure that each and every one that is here came across an idea that perhaps they will be thinking of either tonight, tomorrow, or perhaps even a week or so. And that's really what we're aiming for people to start to question and start to think about answers and search for answers, really. I really like one of the quotes that you mentioned, but before I get into that, I wanted to reiterate that this lecture is being brought to you by a partnership between the Belize National Historical Society. We have Mr. 𝗟𝗲𝗹𝗏 here, and also in collaboration with the Institute for Social and Cultural Research and the University of Belize. And going back to the quote that you shared about history and how it is really how it is understood, how it is interpreted. I wanted to end off our discussion today with a quote from historian 𝗕𝗲𝗃𝗏𝗏. He states, how exactly the past gets remembered and forgotten, how it gets worked into arresting images and coherent stories, how it gets ordered into reliable explanations, how it gets pulled and pummeled into reasons for acting, how it gets celebrated and disavowed, suppressed and imagined, all have tremendous consequences for how the future might be shaped. All of the ways in which the past gets fashioned into histories, consciously and unconsciously, remain crucial for how the present can be grasped. I think that our discussions on Belizean nationalism and history and nationalism and revisionist historians is also something that is very important, to recognize that there are multiple explanations to the past, and really it is how well crafted and how well defended you have an argument that makes a huge difference in having historical discussions. So with that said, I want to thank each one of you for taking the time out to participate in this discussion. And at the same time, I also want to invite you to our second, which is yet to be decided, right, David? We're going to be announcing the date further on.
We will announce.
But we want to continue the discussion.
Yeah.
We'll announce the date later on, but we want to keep on the discussion. I think that it has been rich, and I go to rest now with a lot of thoughts, and that's really good. So have a good night, and thank you, everyone.
𝗕𝗲𝗏𝗏,
Thank you, everyone.
April, Rolando, Albert, thanks everyone, and thanks for everyone who joined us tonight. I think I'm really interested in seeing how I can share more of the research that I've done, and I've committed to doing the third part of the third lecture in this series from Belize in September, hopefully as a part of the month of celebrations, as a key activity there. So hopefully we can get all the students and others in a room and also live stream at the same time. Thank you guys very much.
Thanks for that teaser. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you to all the attendees, and thank you, Dr. Gomez.